horse drifted alarmingly in the betting was, fancied in the morning, continued to drift. It was late on the exchanges to lose. It was something you'd see in a Dick Francis novel, Charles Buttons.
The ground is soft. It's
heavy.
It's soft on times.
It's heavy.
Okay.
Hello and welcome to the Bar Steward's Inquiry Sunday Sermon, an absolute blockbuster of a show we've got for you today. We've got Ryan Pitcher joining us later in the show, and also Abby McGregor to discuss all affordability baloney. But before that, we always like to have a bit of fun. We got to do on sermons, otherwise it's all boring, ain't it? So John Lang and Lorne Malvo join me again this evening for some more shenanigans before we get on with the serious stuff. Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening.
Yeah, and I think, John, you need to tell listeners about your exploits yesterday before we get going. A 3-wood to 6 foot from 220 odd yards for the par 5. Did you eagle it?
In all fairness, I was fucking incredible.
You sound like Chris now.
Yeah, deluded.
Well,
yeah.
Second shot into this par 5, Texas scramble, 3 playing partners had all had shots and failed to negotiate the ditch in front of the green. So, in the spirit of gung-ho, takes the 3-1 out, few raised eyebrows from the teammates, throw everything at it except the soap. Jason's dad actually said he winced when he saw me hit it.
Yeah.
Now,
I'm gonna say, John, you're amazing at this. I mean, you say yourself, you. When was the last time you picked a club up?
A year ago.
Yeah, I'm sure.
yeah.
Doing in about 6 foot, I think, eventually.
Oh, lovely.
And you're slotted cool, cool as you.
Yeah.
Chris,
honestly, yeah.
Chris, is he turning into a golf club bore?
Oh my God! It'll be like, oh Jesus, sitting there like Graham Good on the 19th. Yeah. Oh my! But I have to say, anybody that can master golf, my efforts at golf. I mean, I had a terrible tendency to top the ball, which is nothing worse than when you top it, is it? You don't mind slicing it miles or hooking it, but when you top it, it runs sort of 20 feet. You feel such a prick, don't you? Especially when you got like $2,000 worth of ping clubs that you bought, under the impression that you're actually going to be good at it. But no, I did try. I had lessons, but anybody can play golf. Fucking Chris, gets my respect.
Chris, weren't you a member at Wentworth?
I was, yeah. I was a member at Wentworth, and for a very short period of time before they kind of jacked the fees out. And I actually got to know Sarah Ferguson very well because they had a fitness centre there, and I did for another short-lived attempt to get fit. I got a personal trainer who was a guy called Josh Saltzman, who was an American guy that was what was he? He got a kind of gold medal at Greco-Roman wrestling at whatever Olympics. Genuinely.
Oh, wow.
And he was a genuine, and he was also Sarah Ferguson's personal trainer. I got talking to her quite a lot, and she was actually, I'm no royalist, but she was actually quite a down-to-earth person because she used to have like the session after me, like. So yeah, I'm a friend of the stars, me, I promise you. But then they put the fees up and they got rid of all the poor people.
What was it? Yeah, just out of interest, because obviously, like now you'd have to sell a kidney and a liver.
It was. I mean, I remember at the time it was something like 200 notes a year, which at the time was lumpy. I mean, it was dear, but it was doable, and they were sort of having me, and it was they were desperate for members, but then they got bought out by a guy called Elliot Bernard, who owned something called Chelsfield Group, and they spent a lot of money, did it up, and of course then the fee hike followed, and it became $1,000, which was kind of doable maybe, but then after that he got bought out, and it was like $50,000 to venture, and it was all Chinese now, but it was it was fabulous, as you could imagine, but the good thing was half the fees went towards a subsidised restaurant and bar. So you might have paid $1,000, but you could use 500 quid of that as credit behind the bar and all that, and it was all subsidised. So you get a fabulous meal for like a tenner. So it was an incredible place, but now it's billionaires only there. It was extraordinary. But the thing about Wentworth, before you get into it, is that they had a rivalry with Sunningdale. Now Sunningdale was always, perhaps not quite as well resourced in terms of the clubhouse, but they were much snobbier. And people like Bruce Forsyth and Jimmy Tarbuck applied to join, thinking, well, we're members of Wentworth, and they were blackballed, not posh enough. So no one could get in Sunningdale unless you were sort of royalty. But that was the royalty. That was the sort of the rivalry. But yeah, I mean, fascinating.
I'm glad they kept Tommy out. I hate that bastard.
Yeah, I'm not. I never found his sort of cheeky, chappy humour funny. But my only, I mean, incredible place. It's like I said in the article. You meet people that you would never meet in normal life. I mean, I had James Hunt. Remember him? He bought me an orange juice in the bar. I was sitting there with my dad, and he said, "Oh, do you want a drink?" So my dad got talking to him, and then classic James Hunt. He was chain smoking Marlboros. He bought me a couple of orange juice, bought my dad a couple of pints, and vice versa. And then he said, "I've got to go. I've got to meet a lady." And this sort of like 6-foot model came sashaying in, real stunner. And then he sort of scooped her up, winked. It's like classic George Best. Where did it all go wrong? But he was a fascinating guy. But I'd never encountered those people before or since. But yeah,
I think that's a wonderful thing about gambling. That how it's back in the day. There's so many tales to tell like this, and you met so many characters like this, and some of your stories are absolutely top class. But it's a life lived, Chris, isn't it?
It is, and even the dogs. I mean, like I think I mentioned before, Roger Waters, who had quite a few grounds with Terry Darton. I got to know him, not well, but I used to see him regularly. And I tell the story where he owned a mile stretch of the River Test. Now, I'm not a fisherman, but apparently it's like prime sort of, trout fishing territory. And there's a very exclusive fishing club. I can't remember the name now. It's only got like 30 members. And I think Prince Charles is like a life member, but it's sort of stratospherically wealthy people. And they wanted to buy this off Roger Waters. And he's not a fisherman at the time. And I said, well, what are they offering? He goes, 7 million. And I said, well, fucking sell it. He said, nah, fuck them. That's what Roger Waters said. He said, fuck them. He said that's the only thing good about being rich.
And back hook him.
Yeah, you just tell him. He said, fuck him. He said, I don't need the money. Fuck them. And he said, they did everything up the offer. Nah, bollocks to them. So, what money gives you, it doesn't make you happy, but it gives you options that you don't have if you don't have money. But he was a nice guy.
Make other people unhappy, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. I've been rich, I've been poor and unhappy. Is not as good as rich and unhappy. So yeah, but that's what gambling gives you, and sport gives you. I think it mixes different social classes together, and it's quite interesting.
Yeah, and to touch on Nick Davis's article today. Regarding like old-fashioned skullduggery, and this is an amazing tale. I probably should have released it for. I might release it for free after a while.
You should. It's tremendous.
I think it needs a wider audience. Nick did some research and he found a tale of. So back in the days of how long ago was it? It was 1800s or something. When was it? I can't remember. I can't remember the time frame. It was ages ago. So this lord. So you think that we've got it bad now with the skullduggery clan that goes off now with the Dylan Kits and everything in this world, whatever, Charles Burns, right? Back then, so this lord, to basically sum it up briefly, decided to sue his jockey for not stopping one when ordered. And the remarkable thing. Well, the judge ruled in favour of the lord and fined the jockey £82.06 for his
right. Quite right. Know your place. Yeah. Know your place. But look, it's so interesting. Again, I used to work with a guy that he was quite a strange character, but his dad used to have horses with R.J. Arcali. Do you remember that owner? R.J. Arcali used to have horses with Robert Armstrong way back. And he was, Cully was, I don't know what he was. He was a big mover and shaker in the Hong Kong jockey club scene. I think he might have been actually on the panel of stewards. So he's very well to do, this chap. And he sort of told a tale. They had a horse with, they had Pat Ellery on it, and they didn't miss their price, blah, blah, blah. And, and Armstrong said, like, the owners are there. He said, we'd like you to, give this a fucking run up. And Ellery said, he said, I don't think you understand. He said, I do not do those sort of things. If you want that, use another jockey. So my friend's dad said, well, there's a grand in it. And Pat Ellery, without turning her hair, said, "Where do you fucking want it to finish?" That was it. You know? And he said, but the beautiful thing, he never missed a beat. It wasn't just literally the same sense. Where would you like it to finish? What position? Because there's a grand in it. So yeah, it is fascinating. And people that don't gamble don't understand that if you like that sort of thing in life, it's, you know, you can't beat sport for that, can you?
No, it's brought together many a friendship and certainly a lot of lived experience.
Yes.
is the sort of watchword of the younger generation these days. And we've all done it. Myself, you, and John have certainly lived a life, and I think he's fulfilling as well. It's not just all about the money. It's about it's about what we've experienced, and yeah, absolutely. And some of your tales, Chris, are excellent, as are John's. And John,
definitely
coming to you now, because for you made a comment on this. Was it on the show? You said about the Ascot Ground, and you're not happy with it. And I think from Saturday we can safely say that the times that were given, when you've got Group 1 horses and Group 3 horses running 4 seconds slower than standard, how on earth is good in the description when they're strung out like a Foss-Lass sort of novice hurdle?
It's a kip, isn't it? Let's be fair.
Yeah.
This isn't the first King George where we've had really well fancied horses grossly underperforming. And I mean grossly underperforming. I mean, you're talking a Derby when they're coming there and getting beat over a furlong.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Emily Upjohn, although she's won on the course, she's performed abysmally twice. Westover's only 50-50.
Yeah.
You literally can't take them out to the bank at Ascot. I mean, we were saying after the row meeting, Bidler Farm.
Yeah, we can't trust it. Yeah.
No, it's very much becoming a standalone racecourse, rather like the July course in Newmarket.
It's very, very sad. When we used to have really high going stick descriptions on the straight course at Ascot, it was producing, I felt back then, sort of half reliable results. But since the taps are always turned on, we're getting these, like, again, like you look back to Ascot, and Tony Calvin, the thumb, has got a point here when he says, you know, you look at the Ascot handicaps, you know, like you're getting horses like Jimi Hendrix winning by 10 wickets, and then Docklands, you know.
It's utterly unforeseeable, isn't it?
Yeah, you're getting some very strange outcomes. I mean, look at the Hannon 2-year-old on Saturday.
Yeah.
I mean, that has won like an absolute, you know, if that was trained by HRA Cecil back in the day, this would be getting quotes of, you know, like ridiculous quotes for the guineas, the way that's won. But there's something about the course that makes me believe that, like, you look at the distance from first to last and you're thinking, no. But what is remarkable, I know there was a headwind, but what remarkable for me is that it's allowed to go on where that Clark has described that ground as good in any shape or form. Like, good should not be in that description, should it?
It shouldn't. But again, it comes back to the fact that there's no motivation whatsoever for anyone at the BHA to get the ground around this.
Yeah.
It's good for the gross profits tax deal.
Yeah. I must admit, it kind of, like, there are certain tracks now where doing this full time, I'm thinking, I don't really like betting here. And that's caused by overzealous watering policies. I believe Cooper Clark has been guilty of that in recent times. That's changed a little bit this time round. We give credit where it's due on the show. Cooper Clark has, for me, been a lot better with his watering policy. Have we had any influence on that? Who knows? You know, who knows? I mean, I'm not saying we have directly, but certainly we might cause pressure within the industry to say, what are we doing?
I don't think we've had as much influence as the BHA not getting their hands around it as that.
Yeah.
Because
I think all punches want is consistency.
Yes.
It's the uncertainty. It's the problem. You know, if you're going to chuck water on and it's going to make the ground slot all the time, if that's consistently the case and accurately reported, then you pays your money and you takes your choice. The enemy of gamblers or successful gamblers is uncertainty. That's the problem. You know, whether you agree with putting the slop on or water on or not, the problem is you don't know how much and to what extent it's affected the ground because the reports are inaccurate, and that's a minefield. And as John says, you know, that's terrific for bookmakers, isn't it? But when you see Derby winners tailed off like 3 miles, there has to be something wrong. There has to be.
Yeah, I certainly. I mean, it might be a shrewd decision, John, for Desert Crown in terms of stout sort of, side.
That's retired though. Never race again, right?
Yes,
No?
Stott has revived it on the Gallops apparently.
Yes.
When Captain Stott wins the Judgement,
Yeah.
We love info. See, that's where info gets you. I mean, that's another thing, Chris. We talk about info bets versus form bets, and we all get a tip. We all do. And everyone's laughing at me and saying, oh, you shouldn't have tweeted that. You're an idiot. Yes, I am an idiot for tweeting it. The point is, you're only as good as your informant. However, when you study form and time and you've got skin in the game and you can equate a horse's performance better than most, that's where the edge is. The problem is you have to trust the information. That's half the problem. And we always get the bad tip. A lot of us don't. We all do. We all get the information by I've had a tip for this. The trainer says this can't get beat. And you look at the prices, it's like 3 to 1. It's been 4 to 1. You think, oh, this looks sexy, doesn't it? And then it's tailed off. And then it's like,
Well, it's the difference, as you said, Lee, between, I think you made the point previously, between level 1 info, which you might get a handful of times a year if you're lucky, and the rest. So people that say never listen to info, it's all shit. Well, it is. It plainly isn't, because there is some types of information from certain sources that you'd be mad to ignore. But the default position must be that most information is shit overall, apart from the handful of times a year where you get something that absolutely is from the right people, and 9 times out of 10 they win. So part of the skill is sifting out the wheat from the chaff, isn't it? I think it's foolish to ignore all information as a blanket policy.
Yes, of course.
But equally, you have to be super skeptical, and because even those closest to the horses aren't party necessarily to the plans that the trainer and the owner may have. That information you had was doubtless imparted in good faith. No one's lying, no one's sort of making it up. But that individual clearly, perhaps was not party to information that he or she didn't know.
No, exactly. So this is the thing. I sort of hold my hands up here and say, look, maybe I was a bit sort of quick on the old thing, but when they've got certain things right in the past, consistently, you gain trust in like you would. Like, say if someone had told you, right, giving you 3 from 3. And they've all been back, they've all won, and then the 4th one drifts to out of 8s from 2s, and then you get laughed at. That was like me, on Twitter. So kind of that's how it goes. You try and sort of be clever or be ahead of the game, and sometimes it bites you on the arm.
Well, again, the bet hasn't failed yet. The horse hasn't run since, has he? Everyone's assuming that, but it could just be a clever ruse. I
think next year's Brigadier Gerard's a cut-off point, isn't it?
It's got John. It's got to be for breeding on it for Desert Crown. I mean, surely if you don't run this year, Saeed Sahel is going to want some return on his winning a Brigadier.
The trouble is, with his record as it stands, I mean, all right, a Dante in the Derby's all right, but he only would have made 2 as a stallion. I mean, he's going to be in a Banana Republic, isn't he?
Yeah, be standing next to Halft. Oh.
Yeah.
There we go. So basically, me and John are unanimous, I think, in viewing Ascot's Saturday form as kip, and we don't believe in it. We're not going to go to the bank with it, and I think that's good advice for Billy Bunters across the land.
Isn't it a tragedy, though, really, when you think in the wider context of the sport, that we've had to write off the forms from the Royal meeting and now this?
Yeah, absolutely. But then this is how we, what's left of the game, we make it pay. I mean, this is the thing. We've got the skill and experience to know when we see reliable form and when we see kip form, which is this, like out. If you price the King George again on nice, absolutely fair ground at York over 1.5 miles, you for a fact you wouldn't take anything relevant from Ascot at all with any of it. You just ignore it and then price it up how you would normally. So that's it. It's kind of weird times we're in terms of ground at the moment. But Ascot are certainly failing the test in terms of producing a fair racing surface.
Yes, it's all ripped up and get the temperature down.
Yeah, absolutely. Get the carpet down, but always spray it green, as we always say on this show. Yes. Right. I mean, some good discussion so far. Just one thing leading into the second part of the show for the serious bores of affordability. Interesting post from AK today on Twitter regarding Australian banks, bank accounts, Bendigo banks.
It's Jeff's brother, Australian banks.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jeff.
Yeah. A cunt in crocodile shoes. Anyway.
Snakeskin platform.
Yeah. Yeah, Jimmy Nail. So this Bendigo bank has suspended bank accounts of bookmakers, on-course bookmakers, basically, the ones that deal in cash. Now, this is where I come to the globalist agenda, because it's all the same. It's all the same. They don't like cash, and this has affected Australian on-course bookmakers. Bendigo Bank have said, no, we're not dealing with bookmakers anymore. Bank somewhere else. It's our choice. It's bank policy. There you go. Now, it's worrying, isn't it, Chris?
It's very worrying, and you can get all Bob Lazar about it, but look what happened to Farage. Now, whether you agree with his politics or not is irrelevant, really, isn't it? There is an agenda in play here. There's no doubt that the fact that cash is a dirty word now, isn't it? But betting's a dirty word, and it's all part of the same broad strategy to get you to a contactless society that involves, you spending your money on the things that they, in quotes, want you to spend it on. And gambling is not one of them. And, as we'll touch on later, it's as plain as a nose on your face. And if anyone doubts it, the fact that the Racing Post have finally woken up now to this, albeit too late in my view, but it's worrying. But, it's part of a grand scheme in my view, I think.
I do. I think it's a sort of a modern world, Western world, if you like, order. It's like Order 66 if you watch Star Wars, where the Emperor says Order 66.
There is to give you a bit of heart.
Well, they might do.
There is a bit of pushback. I mean, without being overly optimistic, I did speak to one of those great arbiters of truth, a cab driver yesterday, a local one, and he said, and Southend, on the seafront, all the cafes, etc., normally have the card payments. A number have taken a view that they said they don't want to take card payments now; it's cash only, because a lot of people are waking up and say, "Hang on a minute, the fact is that people can track your spending. The card machines are unreliable. If they go down, then you're in a bit of stuck. So it's cash only. So few people are waking up to it. Too little, too late, in my view. But I think there's definitely something afoot there. Whether it's an organised conspiracy, who knows? But it's definitely something going on.
Yeah, like why would Australian banks suddenly do what like UK banks are doing with on-course bookmakers? We know of stories of on-course bookmakers in the UK that have been shut down by banks, and so this is going on at a rapid pace, and I don't like the scenario we're in. But this leads us on to the second part of the show, where we're going to bring in some people to discuss certain topics. Joining us now on the Sunday sermon is a special guest by the name of Ryan Pitcher. And for those of you that haven't heard of Ryan, he was recently featured in an article in the Racing Post written by Lee Mottershead. And this was on gambling harm groups that aren't necessarily solving the problem of gambling harm. And a lot of the funding of where it's going is not being used properly. Welcome to the show, Ryan.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, very keen to get you on, because this is a very interesting subject for many of us, in the fact that it's affecting a lot of punters, the way that these checks are going to be carried out on people. And I've heard of horror stories where punters can't bet because of these checks. And the fact is, if all these claims of statistics of suicides, etc., are false, surely this is something that needs looking at and investigating, Ryan. But we'll come on to that in a minute, because I'd like to sort of get on to you first, and you personally, because can you tell me how you set up your charity, Nout Left to Lose? A good old Yorkshire phrase. Yeah, Nout Left to Lose.
Northern slang term there, isn't it?
Yeah.
Essentially, I was harmed by gambling. So I had a gambling addiction for around 15 years. And at the start of the first lockdown, so March 2020, was when I came into gambling addiction recovery. So sort of applying an abstinence-based approach to my gambling. And I set up the All Bets Are Off podcast, which is for those going through a similar journey, I guess. But we get a lot of people listening to it, doctors, researchers, etc., people within the industry as well. We've had lots of politicians, people with lived experience on there. And essentially my 15-year journey culminated in me stealing over six figures from a family member and committing some bits and pieces in terms of crime. Essentially, I wanted to set up the podcast and also Not Left to Lose, which was then set up following the podcast to go out and teach young people around the potential harms of gambling. Take a very pragmatic approach to things. I think you touched upon some of the data and the statistics, which there's always big question marks around. So I try to implement factual information as opposed to bashing the industry. I've got friends within the industry as well. Do I think the industry played a small role in the harm? Yes. I'm more than happy to questions on that. But ultimately, I take responsibility for my own actions. And Not Left to Lose was going into schools and essentially providing prevention strategies so people didn't follow the same path as what I did.
Yeah, this is the thing that I want gamblers, punters to understand about harm, because I've made good friends with people that I've met online that have suffered harm, real good friends with people. And I'm obviously from the opposite spectrum. This is what I do for a living, I bet for a living. So I'm intrigued to listen to the stories of how people have got themselves into these situations. Mm-hmm. And there's one thing that we're for as a podcast. We feel that people that suffer gambling harm should get the correct sort of remedy, whatever that is. Yeah. I'm not skilled enough to speak. Coming on later on the show, Abby McGregor, she has her theories regarding how to treat gamblers that have suffered harm. So without going into too much technical thing, what is your ideal solution? What would you like to see happen? Because the money obviously is sizable that is getting dished around by the Gambling Commission, who we believe are inept. I think you kind of share a similar view, shall we say. So what would Ryan Pitcher do?
No recovery is linear, and I think it's important that we have a bunch of different options. For me, just speak to people with lived experience was incredibly beneficial. I think it's two very different points here in terms of recovery methodology and in terms of the sphere itself, in terms of the gambling harm sphere. Coming on to that, you're right, there's a lot of money being dished around and some of it I'm quite sceptical on. I think the article with the Racing Post sort of shed some light on that, not just me, but others within the space as well that also had their say. I think there's a lot of projects that are going on that you look at things and you just can't see the overall impact on that. You're talking hundreds of thousands of pounds, millions, tens of millions being lauded about, and you just can't see the impact on it. Often there's lacking of data reports around the impact, and coming from, I guess, somewhat of an insider's perspective, because people within the space do talk to one another, you get to gauge how successful certain things are going, whether it be a pilot or a project or whatever it may be. And you see things, you speak to people where you know things are failing, and you know figures are being gaslighted, and all in order to get money through the door. And this is a massive concern for me. Reverting back to the recovery side of things, if there is anyone that happens to listen to the podcast that is going through harm, certainly listen to some content around specifically engaging with people with lived experience. So whether it be listening, speaking to those people, I get lots of people reaching out to me, and I often talk to individuals that are very much at the start of that journey, throughout that journey, and trying to help them. Going to professional services as well, skeptical on some of them as well, it must be said. I'd say just facing up to it and be willing to talk about it.
I'm a bit of a dinosaur in this game, and what's happened to the old Gamblers Anonymous way of treating harm? I obviously know people that went through that. Obviously, a lot of gamblers did relapse. The good thing with that, though, it was always turned into a positive where they would declare it to the group and you'd get support from the group. And they'd turn it into a positive by saying, well, you've admitted it and now you can move forward again with your life. And I find that uplifting. People do need that to speak to people. What's happened with Gamblers Anonymous is it's like they've disappeared off the face of the earth in terms of treatment.
Yeah, they are still about operating. I've got experience of it. And for me, I dabbled in it. It wasn't a route that worked for me. But again, the co-host of my podcast, for example, swears by, he's got cross addiction. He swears by GA and AA, and to be respectful of that. I think for me personally, I struggle to separate Christian ways of the GA. There's a higher power and all this sort of stuff. Me personally, I struggle with that. But a lot of people, it provides them with an semblance of comfort, I guess. And I totally understand that. I just really struggle with it. And so that's not me having a pop at GA. And some of the groups that I was part of as well, I wasn't happy with. And speaking to other people in GA, it's very much a determinant of how your group is. My group that I initially went to, we had old timers in there that hadn't had a bet in, talking some of them 3-4 decades. And that's great. They still come along and pass on their wisdom and stuff. But the way that I found that they were speaking to me as very much a newcomer to the circle was quite patronizing sometimes. And I struggled with that. I like to have my say, and I struggle to be quite so passive in discussion, I guess. Maybe that's a trait I need to look at, but it just didn't suit me. But that's not to say they're not around and they don't do great work. It works for many, many people, many guests that we've had, for example.
Going back to the gambling harm groups, you've already touched on it, I suppose, with regards to funding, that they seem to be using studies, work, statistics that aren't really accurate, have been proven to be false as well. The Gambling Commission themselves have admitted that certain statistics regarding suicide and the number of children addicted to gambling are demonstrably false. So why do they keep using these statistics?
Well, it's politically motivated, isn't it? We know the answer to that. Take a very pragmatic approach in a sense where when I look at research and data, I'm also looking at the angle. What's it trying to achieve and stuff? And I think we get that from both sides, if you want to call it side of the debate. We can both agree upon that. But I'm with you. It's scary that these sorts of things get published. The Racing Post article very much touched upon it. They're not peer reviewed. It's not going through the correct channels. There's certain things when it comes to quantitative data that I'm skeptical on, particularly with former methodology used to write up the numbers with respect to gambling harms. I think it's a very old way of doing things through telephone surveys and whatnot. But yeah, with respect to some of the groups that have been set up to provide, whether it be research, education, treatment, recovery solutions, call it what you will, all these projects, all this money getting bandied about, look at some of it and it goes back to what I was saying before. You just don't see the necessary impact on it. I think they're going towards a route where there's obviously been a lot of debate and dialogue with respect to the NHS as well. And I think they've been trying to go down a route which maybe starting to put money towards local authorities. We've seen stuff in the Northwest and whatnot, particular group up there. I'm not going to mention names there, but a particular authority in the Northwest, a few £100,000 was awarded recently. And looking from an outsider's perspective and knowing some of the people that are involved within that, for the large part, I think, based on my discussions, it's been a bit of a failure. Yet recently we've seen another north of, well, almost £750,000 awarded. Based on what? It's flabbergasting. Where's the impact? Show me the impact. Is it worth it? And I see this across the board, research, education and treatment. Obviously, there's two types of funding mechanisms. There's regulatory settlement, reg set, the easy way to say it, and also RET donations from gambling operators. And honestly, I could talk about it all day. It's crazy, and I'm sure you're going to ask me some questions on it. So
absolutely. The thing to do with me, with the big corporations, is they seem to be on side with the way this is going. Affordability checks, big fines. Now, forgive me for being cynical about Big Corp, that for me have rinsed a lot of vulnerable people over time. Now are in their possession is sensitive data from customers in order to, shall I say, maybe get rid of some winning accounts from their portfolio whilst keeping some of the people that are still vulnerable in play. They're very disingenuous from all sides here at the moment. You've got the Gambling Commission that are pumping money into projects. For me, it's either incompetence or this is sinister, because why a Gambler Aware pocketing another 32 million when they've already got 31 point something in the bank?
I know. Where's that money going? That's the thing, is I can only speculate. Part of me thinks, God, it must be going into some form of like investment portfolio as opposed to actually the people that need it on the ground. I just don't know. Even when I spoke to operators, so I would speak to operators at the minute you've got this voluntary system. But if you were to go on the Gamble Aware website, you would think that it was something that had to be done. You would think it is compulsory, where licensed gambling operators pledge a percentage of their profits. And I speak to operators, and seldom are they prepared to move around from donating to Gamble Aware. And I don't criticize them. To the operators, that would have been extremely unprofessional of me. But part of me is thinking, well, I approach you as a startup and explain to you, your 70 grand would fund me for a whole year and be responsible for delivering to 11,000-ish children and young people preventative strategies. Okay, that's basically what my approach was. You see the hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of pounds being dished around. I was after 70k, a year's worth of prevention activities, and they go, no, we're just going to give it to Gamble Aware. And I'm thinking, well, hang on a minute, they've got tens of millions in the bank. It's just going to basically sit on top. Why would you want to do that? It makes absolutely no sense. And like you, I have to take myself back into being on when I was gambling. Would I want my data being shared around? Absolutely not. I totally understand that in terms of from a privacy perspective and all that sort of stuff. Totally get it. Even though I've suffered harm myself, I'm as much on the side of punters that ultimately the vast majority of people can gamble responsibly. I totally appreciate that, understand that, okay? And I'm as much about this sort of space as I am about being fair for punters. You look at the fantastic work that Brian does for Justice for Punters and stuff like that. And it's crazy that nowadays, if you show any sorts of nous in terms of betting, you're banned, heavily restricted. I think that's dirty as well. I come from this spectrum of very much middle ground, I think. Said it a couple of times. I'm very pragmatic in that sense. So
the recent Gamblers Consumer Forum that's been set up basically to tackle the government and these harm groups, I think, in the right way. They want to see the right treatment for addicts, because that's vital. If we're going to bring in intrusive checks or we're going to do something, then surely it's got to be done correctly.
Listen, they're walking contradictions, a lot of the far left in this debate. It pains me. Take the NHS, for example. They chose to make a play and chose to stick to the far left because essentially ahead of the white paper, they were promised, if you stay here on this particular side, you're going to get a shed ton of money. Okay, now they've realised that it's not going to quite happen like that. Oh, all of a sudden, get cushy again with the industry. And it's a bit like some of the far left groups. They often bemoan people and have a pop at people, including me. I've faced a bit of a wrath for taking operator money, for taking money from the industry. To me, it doesn't matter where the money comes from. One of the larger groups, they've just taken money from regulatory settlement. To me, that is industry money. It doesn't matter how it's dressed up. A regulatory settlement and or a rep donation, it's all the same. It comes from the industry. I don't care how you try and dress it up. And there's a lot of people being used, a lot of people being essentially brainwashed. And this is what I really do care about in this particular space, is there's lots of people with lived experience, vulnerable people that are trying to do the right thing and go down a path of giving back to society, whether it's because they've done a lot of bad things during their active addiction years and they just want to do the right thing, okay? And people are being used as pawns, weapons, being abused, and it's causing a lot of harm. So this is a space that is meant to be a safe place for people in recovery that are lived experience and so forth. But what I'm finding is totally the opposite. People that work for gambling harm prevention charities, not-for-profits, people with lived experience getting absolutely battered on social media in their DMs and stuff for working for certain organisations, and it absolutely makes me sick. And that should not be going on. And this is the far left groups that are doing this and their followers and stuff. And it needs to stop. And that's something that I am really passionate about.
Yeah, it comes through there, Ryan, as well. So basically, some of the big lefty groups are, in your opinion, responsible for us being at this point now, maybe, where it's a complete mess.
Absolutely. And it's all political plays, power plays and so forth. We've seen a journey of it. And we're now here, really, let's face it, we thought the white paper might be the shining light where you could understand where the lay of the land was going and stuff, but it hasn't turned out that way. So now there's more manoeuvring, more posturing and so forth. But yeah, I think there's been a lot of harm caused by not just to people, as I've just touched upon, but just in terms of the whole sphere and uncertainty that it's caused with regards to funding and so forth, because of whatever they're trying to gain. Ultimately, does the industry need to change, adapt and so forth? I think yes. It's very easy to pick out these cases in the paper where people have committed large-scale fraud, etc., to fund their gambling addiction, impacted others and so forth. Look, I've done it myself. These are rare cases. They do need to be highlighted and so forth, but we do need to see the industry shift a little bit. But the overall picture of things is just, it's a mess now as it was 2-3 years ago, to be honest, 4 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, do you also think that, again, we're not going to name names, but do you think some of these gambling harm groups, charities, have commercial motivations, perhaps?
100%. It goes without saying. A lot of them, particularly the most prominent group, and you can cast your own aspersions, any listeners, a lot of them are on good money, are taking home a good salary. And yeah, of course, a lot of it is to do with money, very much as the article touched upon during the corridors at these gambling harm events. A lot of the discussions about money, where you're getting your funding and so forth. And it's the same with this. It's motivated largely, I'm not saying exclusively, but largely due to money. A lot of them profess not to be anti-gambling. There certainly are anti-gambling for sure. And people from that particular persuasion, let's say, they look at people like me thinking that I'm defending the industry. And I'm just defending what's right. And ultimately is, like I said a few moments ago, I'll defend punters in a sense where they should be able to get their bets on, and the industry need to take a long look at themselves, to be honest, a good long look at themselves with respect to some of the things that we've seen with regards to profiling customers, not just from a harm perspective, but also, as I say, closing off accounts with anyone showing an ounce of now. To be honest, I consider the industry itself, you can get a bet on nowadays, for the large part, you've got to be a mug punter, because it's just not possible to do it through the regulated industry. But a whole nother conversation, I'm sure.
It is. Ryan, it's been fabulous having you on the show, and I'm sure our listeners will find you a breath of fresh air coming from a sector full of lizards, shall we say.
It's honestly, there is so much more to be said. Some of the stuff that I've come across, seen, that has happened to me, that has happened to people that I know in this particular sector. My last message would be, if anyone, I don't suspect you've got a mass audience on the sort of kind of like recovery side of things or the gambling harm spectrum, but if anyone does happen to listen to this, from whether it be through the Gambling Commission, some of these large scale organisations in this space, they need to take a look at themselves and they need to change, because what's going on right now is appalling and people stay quiet. And the reason why people stay quiet is because they don't want to impact the pocket. And we should be thinking about the people that genuinely need the help and support, and those that work within the sector that are being tragically negatively impacted.
We see the same problem in the racing industry where the media have all got bookmaker contracts and bookmaker blogs, so they won't call the operators out on instances where they should do. And like you say, no one is helping anyone. Everyone's fighting for their own little space, and everyone needs to come together here and form a proper solution that helps all. It's that simple. It doesn't feel like we're ever going to get there. Ryan, I thank you very much, and I wish you well in future endeavours. And I'm sure this won't be the last pod we'll see you on either, or hear you on. Yes, thank you, Ryan. And a big warm welcome. We've got Abby McGregor in the room of the Gamblers Consumer Forum. Welcome, Abby.
Thank you for having me again.
So, Abby, the consultation papers that's been released regarding affordability, what's your take on those?
First, let's start off with what the purpose of the Gambling Commission is. It's actually a bit of a misconception that the regulator's role is to, quote, support the industry. It's actually a lot more specific than that. It's to protect and defend the interests of the consumer. Yet that is very clearly not happening here. This is in stark contrast to regulators such as Ofcom, where the Communications Act requires them to regularly consult with consumers, and they do this mainly via something called the Communications Consumer Panel. So what we're seeing here in the gambling industry is a huge seismic gap between the consumer and the organisation that is supposed to stand up for the consumer. So much so that they've actually turned off their comments on Twitter for their consultation to prevent engagement with the consumer. But that is not even the most concerning part that the Gambling Consumers Forum have uncovered recently. The Gambling Commission have not been the accountable voice that they are legally obliged to be when the white paper was being designed. So in April 2022, the Gambling Commission described Public Health England's claims regarding gambling-related suicides as unreliable, yet they did not forward this information to the government. Now, this is why it's important for the Gamblers Consumer Forum to confront the problem with the current addiction narrative. Now, obviously, the Gambling Commission, as we all know, for anyone who has read the front page of the Racing Post, has got themselves into another storm over the possibility of gamblers facing affordability checks every 6 months and this new 7-day rule that basically ignores large wins. Now, given that 99.8% of their consumers gamble risk-free, clearly this is not in the best interests of the majority of the consumers. So they've failed their basic fundamental role as a regulator. So the Gamblers Consumer Forum will be writing to them as well as responding to their consultation, and we'll be asking for a meeting with them to discuss our concerns. Now, as we are a group that seeks to represent the voice of the people that the Gambling Commission are also supposed to represent, we see no reason why they should refuse to meet with us, and we look forward to opening up a reasonable and constructive dialogue with them. We'll also be bringing up during our conversation something called the growth duty, because in addition to engaging effectively with the consumer, a regulator also has a duty to consider the economic consequences of their actions. And the effect on horse racing is a great example of that, because every penny not spent in the regulated market is a penny less going towards betting turnover, which is a penny less off prize money. So we'll publish that letter that we write to the GC on our website, and we'll report back on any meetings. But just to give you an idea of the kinds of points we'll be raising, as I've said many times before, affordability checks won't help addicts, whether you dress it up as ignoring large wins or however often you do it. Addiction is defined by its utter compulsion. Not gambling because you're told you're ineligible to gamble is just read by the addict's brain as a dopamine deficit. So the only two options after that are another addictive agent or the black market. Both of these, as we know, are substitutes for the real solution, which is specialised clinical treatment for addiction recovery. Because money, this whole idea of affordability, money, economics, money is merely the means to gain access to the addictive agent. It's not the addictive agent itself. So therefore, monitoring people's spending habits tells us nothing about any potential addictive behaviours. It just tells us about what their disposable income is like. Now this you will find shocking. The University of Liverpool did a study on monthly loss amounts on slots, and the Gambling Commission cited it. Now, it contained this statement, but the Gambling Commission left it out of its report. This is a statement. This is so important. The data tells us nothing about these individuals. Some may be sufficiently wealthy that losses of this magnitude are not important to them. Others may be returning to the operator large wins earned in the preceding month. So the University of Liverpool did a study on slot losses which contained the massive caveat that losses tell us nothing about the individual, yet the Gambling Commission chose not to report that. And this new consultation that ignores large wins from more than 7 days ago flies in the face of that empirical evidence from the University of Liverpool. So all these 6 monthly affordability checks will do is lump thousands of healthy bettors in with addicts, making it impossible to sift through genuine cases and those just caught up in the criteria, as is the case with the endless list of harm markers that's currently in circulation. We're just going round in circles here. US clinicians were saying 25 years ago that restrictions would not curb gambling addiction, yet here we are. And why are we here today? Because we have dodgy statistics pushing the narrative.
That is spot on. And what I don't get, why are lies being peddled and be allowed to be peddled? And this is not like an accusation or a false accusation. Look at Lord Foster on a GB News interview recently, where he was previously told not to use these statistics regarding suicides and children addicted to gambling because they were already being classed as not accurate by the Gambling Commission themselves. Why did you use them?
Well, let me just start by saying that the Gamblers Consumer Forum are actually in the process of logging a complaint with the Gambling Commission against Gambling with Lives for their misreporting of official statistics during the recent Select Committee. where they spouted nonsense such as 25% of all gamblers are significantly harmed. So we will then move on to Lord Foster and his misreporting of official statistics, because that has to be challenged. Now, whose job is that? Well, that, of course, is the regulator, the Gambling Commission. They are supposed to be the consumer champion challenging these statistics. But of course, they do not. They are fundamentally an anti-gambling organisation. So that's left for the Gamblers Consumer Forum to do, a task we will happily take on. But like you say, why does this happen in the first place? That's because it's an abuse of mistrust by the generally trusting general public. So when most people see statistics used by an organisation, they sort of make the assumption that they're straight reading, i.e. what they are at face value is what they actually are. The raw figure is a reflection of reality. But as we know, statistics used to fit a narrative will always be manipulated to privilege that narrative. Now, a good and very recent example of this is Sadiq Khan's claim that there's been more affordable housing starts in London since he became mayor than the previous mayor, Boris Johnson. Now, the problem with his figure that he's used is housing starts doesn't actually mean fully built, completed houses. What's defined as a housing start isn't even a shovel in the ground, it's just contracts signed. So some of these houses that are being included in the housing starts figure won't be habitable for more than a decade. But not only that, the number also includes demolished properties that are being replaced. So the overall gross number of housing stock hasn't increased. You're just replacing ones you've knocked down. You haven't actually created more homes. But the reason why it's being used is because most people look at that 25,000 new housing starts figure and all they see is 25,000. They just assume that 25,000 new homes have been built because no one checks. When an organisation sends the press release out, who's doing the checking? Well, that works if you've got a strong functioning regulator that's a champion of the consumer. But we have a gambling commission that are doing much of the same thing as City Hall because they've found certain figures to be unreliable and inaccurate when it comes to suicide-related gambling harm, yet they didn't tell the government. So that's why it's being allowed. You've got these statistics being created from dodgy science and you've got no one holding them to account. So then, because they're unchallenged, this narrative becomes the truth. And when it becomes the truth, when it becomes the accepted truth, no one really bats an eyelid when something new comes out because they just assume this is pretty much the consistent narrative of what we've heard before. So therefore, it must be true. It must be real.
Why is it the regulator's role to mandate gambling policy for gamblers? The regulator is just there to regulate. Am I right here? The Gambling Commission is the gambling regulator. But why are they mandating individual policy like this? Why are they coming up with numbers like the 7 day nonsense? You can tell that these sort of numbers are devised by people that haven't got an absolute clue about betting and gambling. Absolutely no clue whatsoever. Am I right?
Well, I mean, absolutely, because the Gambling Commission are not the champion of the 99.8% of people who gamble risk-free. They've become the anti-gambling harm regulator. They see it as their job to prevent gambling harm. The role of a regulator is to support the consumer impartially. And actually what it should be doing is correcting much of what the white paper has tried to correct, which is poor market practices. So the big corps abusing their ability to shut down winning accounts, for example. That's what the regulator should be doing because it's supposed to be the voice of the consumer. So when everyone's been saying, well, where is the voice of the consumer in this debate? What's going on here? We've heard from the big bookmakers, we've heard from the prohibitionists. That is what we have a gambling commission for, except they're not doing their job properly. It's not their job to make the rules. It's their job to ensure the rules benefit the consumer and don't abuse the rights of the consumer. That's why we have a regulator.
Yeah, I mean, why are these falsehoods being allowed to happen? This is what confuses me because it's been proven many a time. The children addiction rates, the suicide rates are absolutely totally false, yet still parroted. I mean the Foster fellow, Lord Foster. Why is everything so disingenuous? Why are we all playing like silly games? Why don't we get the truth in everything that we do? Just lay out the truth of what it is. Why is it down to what Ryan said about funding, that the gambling harm groups literally are just peddling whatever they do? But why the Gambling Commission knowingly sending vast sums of money to groups that, when it's clearly based on a lie?
Well, I want to talk about Ryan's very excellent and valid point about poor research methodology from the perspective of a researcher myself. Now, gone are the days where, because academia is such a closed community now, where it used to be quite free and open and liberal, you can't just make up studies anymore. So there was a study done in the 1920s where a doctor said that the MMR vaccine causes autism. Now, that was just completely made up, just completely and utterly fabricated. But you can't do that anymore because you get too easily found out. So what you have to do is you have to massage the way that you do your study in order to fit the narrative without outright lying, but compromising your data enough that it's still within the boundary of what's, quote, acceptable. So Ryan talks about research methodology. So methodology is basically what methods you use in order to get your data. And a good researcher will select the methodology that has the least potential variable. So there are lots of things that can potentially affect your data, and your job as a researcher is try to minimize the things that will affect your data. So for one of my pieces of research, I looked at how certain hormones affect the functionality of the brain. And in order to do this, I have to test participants. But my problem was, I don't want the participants to know they're being tested, because if they do know, they might engage in something called observer's paradox, where they subconsciously behave differently because they know they're being watched. So I actually have to do some decoy tests. I test them with what I actually want to test them with during what I'm pretending is this kind of polite introductory chit chat. And then I make them do some tests that I never actually really use. Now, this variable minimization is not being used in gambling research. So, for example, the Problem Gambling Severity Index, one of its questions is, have you ever felt guilty about the way you gamble? Now, this is a form of neuro-linguistic programming, which is basically a method used to focus on certain properties in order to provoke a desired outcome. So, i.e., the person writing that question wants you to associate gambling with negative feelings, gambling and guilt. And you can test out how well this neuro-linguistic programming works for yourself. If you recommend a restaurant to a friend and you praise a really particular dish you think they'll like, once they've been, ask them how it is. And I guarantee before they mention the service, the parking, the atmosphere, the rest of the food, they will tell you about that dish because you have subconsciously made it the focus for them. You have programmed their linguistics to focus on that particular thing. And so their answer has been made biased by something that you have said. Now, in good objective research, that should never happen because you don't want it to happen. You don't want anything to compromise your data. But when you have questions like that, where you're essentially implying that gambling is a harmful activity because it has the ability to cause you guilt, that will affect the way that you're answering those questions. And of course, there is such a thing as an implied correct answer. People want to feel, when you're answering a questionnaire, you know you're being tested, you know you're being judged based on your answers, even though it's anonymous. You want to make sure that you are giving, quote, the correct answer. It's part of your kind of evolutionary desire to fit into social groups. You want to give the correct answer. And that is why these questionnaires exploit people, because it's all user diagnosed. So we have dodgy science being replicated into dodgy statistics, and we have no consumer champion to regulate this.
Abby, sorry, cut across. Just to illustrate, wasn't that also the case the failure of the opinion polls to account for Trump's popularity against Hillary Clinton. You know, the exit polls, I've read somewhere that people felt that they should say that they actually voted for Hillary Clinton against Trump, and that accounted for the failure of the opinion polls to predict the results. I think it's something. Is that what you're saying? That the
no,
people
absolutely.
Feel, they feel social pressure almost.
No, absolutely. So a great example of that is when you see opinion polls about gambling advertising. Now, some of them say, do you think we should ban gambling advertising? The fact that you've mentioned a ban in there already implies that, you know, it's something that most people think should happen. But some of them even go as far to say, do you think we should ban gambling adverts to protect vulnerable people? Who would want to answer no to that? Yeah. Because then you're basically implying that you don't care about vulnerable people. So it's all kind of this social manipulation machine to get you to answer the questions the way that they want them to. And the thing about using questionnaires is that what you're asking people to do is to self-diagnose. Now, addiction is a cognitive condition. Whether you agree with the arguments that I've proposed or you agree with the exposure theory that the anti-gambling lobby push out on a daily basis, we can all agree that addiction is something that happens in the brain. It's something that happens with your dopamine regulation, which is a neurotransmitter in the brain. So where are the fMRIs? Where are the brain scans? Where are the EEGs? Where is the empirical cognitive data rather than the questionnaires, the telephone surveys, the user diagnosed data? The reason why I suspect is because it shuts down an entire industry being pumped full of money, and that is the addiction prevention groups. Because let me just leave you with this one thought. Have you ever seen one piece of peer-reviewed scientific research containing neuroimaging techniques, as all other cognitive conditions do, so MRIs, fMRIs, EEGs, that shows that addiction can be prevented? For sure it can be managed, but where is the evidence to suggest that addiction is a preventative condition? The reason why I believe they don't want to have brain scans, they don't want to show that when you put a healthy bettor's brain scan and an addict's brain scan side by side, and you show what happens to those two brains when they place a bet, and you show the dopamine regulation in an addict's brain versus a healthy bettor's brain, they don't want to see the difference, because then that would suggest that addiction cannot be prevented. It is a fundamentally genetic thing, and that would shut down an entire lucrative industry that is addiction prevention groups. They should be addiction management groups. I have never seen one piece of evidence to suggest that you can either prevent addiction from happening or cure someone of addiction. Look at the language that Ryan used. He talked about his journey. He talked about my gambling. He talked about where he is now. He recognizes that he is an addict. He will always be one. He's not cured of his addiction. He's just on a journey that allows him to manage his addiction. I have never seen one brain scan, one piece of empirical cognitive evidence that shows me you can stop addiction, you can cure it, and you can prevent it from ever happening.
Yeah, brilliant points. Abby, why do you think the GC, with its policies and messaging, like you pointed out, you can't reply on Twitter to their personal consultation? In fact, if you want to do their consultation, you have to be probably an academic, because it doesn't say like, oh, I'm a regular punter, what's your views? Why is that?
I think because it's pretty much what we saw in, I think I mentioned before the housing crash in America in 2008. The big bankers talked in all this kind of economic corporate jargon, and they use things like fiduciary standards and whatnot, things that regular people don't understand, because what they're trying to say is, look, leave it to the big boys here. You know, we've got it. So you just sit back and let us all sort it out. They don't want more people involved because they want to keep the narrative that gambling is a fundamentally harmful activity, because there's so much money in anti-gambling harm. That's the thing. And if the Gambling Commission isn't representing the best interests of the consumer, then it's certainly not representing the best interests of the horse racing community or the greyhound community or the thousands of jobs that the gambling industry itself provides and supports. It's just not doing its job because it's become politicised. Everything has become politicised. Addiction has become politicised. And that's why it's important that we challenge these narratives, and we also challenge these statistics that are propping up these narratives.
And it's hugely subjective. Sorry, Lee, isn't it? You're right, Abby, isn't it? It's we live in the world of my truth, in quotes. So a lot of the policy seems to be influenced by very subjective accounts of how gambling or how people perceive gambling has ruined their lives. And I think disproportionate weight is given to, almost witness accounts without actually being tested. Because if you go to court, counsel will cross-examine and test the evidence. But it seems to me that the evidence put forward by people who claim to be the victims of irresponsible gambling seem to be unchallenged, that they go through on the nod. And it's disappointing that those in favour of responsible gambling are having to jump through hoops to apply rigour to the argument that the anti-gambling lobby don't seem to be subject to, and I think that's the disappointing thing. You're having to talk in technical terms, to talk in evidence, but it seems to be enough for some to say, gambling's crap because I ruined my life for it, and then that's taken as read. The fact that they may have other things going on in their lives that may cause them to suffer financial or emotional harm, but if you attribute it to gambling, it's like, well, that's the truth because you say it is, and that's the problem, I think.
Well, that's right. I mean, people who have got lived experience.
That's it, lived experience, not my truth. Sorry, yeah.
Talking about, get it right.
Sorry.
About,
you sound like my wife telling me off. Come here for a break, not be told off, for Christ's sake. Jesus.
We've got a bit more dodgy science peddled on. Thank you very much.
Yeah, right. Fair enough. Yeah, carry on. That's me told.
No, but lived experience is, look, it's a very emotive subject. If you have just lost your child to suicide, I have 3 children. I'd never want anything terrible to happen to them.
No.
But lived experience is not evidence. Lived experience is an account of a journey that you went through or your child went through with addiction. But that is not empirical evidence to link gambling with harm. That is just quite literally somebody's experience, and nobody is actually to say that the cause of the issue is deep rooted in the brain of the addict. That's not blaming addicts at all, but that's sort of that's just how they are. And part of addiction recovery is about learning to have a happy and fulfilling life in spite of your addiction. So we're not trying to blame addicts here. We're not actually trying to blame anybody. It's nobody's fault that someone is addicted. It's just the way they are. As I've mentioned before, it's like children with dyslexia. It's no one's fault that the child has dyslexia. It's just the way they are. And so we have measures in schools to accommodate them and to provide better outcomes for them. But we don't subject everybody to the same measures. We actually actively separate those children out and say, OK, your brain works in a slightly different way. We've provided these measures for you, and therefore we hope that you can still develop in spite of your dyslexia. And that's what we have to do with addiction. But we are using people's emotions to guide whole rafts of policy that have profound economic consequences. Of course, you are going to blame the gambling industry if your child has passed away. And yeah. Of course, that's, if your child has passed away, I mean, it's every parent's worst nightmare. But we still have to fundamentally keep this in the science. Someone's account is not empirical evidence. It's not a crime that's happening here. It's not a witness report. This is empirical evidence that's needed.
And don't you also think that the way that the anti-gambling lobby has skillfully, I think, framed the debate, it's almost as if you disagree, you are by default in favour of irresponsible gambling. It's kind of a binary proposition. The operating assumption is all gambling is bad, and if you do not support these new measures, you are de facto in favour of irresponsible gambling. And to go back to your earlier point, no one wants to sort of say, I'm in favour of it and I don't care. And I think they carefully crafted that narrative to portray themselves as operating or occupying the reasonable middle ground. We know them to be extremists, and we have a view that some are prohibitionists, but they've kind of managed their image to say, well, we're reasonable. We're trying to help people. Who isn't in favour of, saving lives and improving the quality of life for people? And I think that's where I think the industry has missed the trick by sitting on its hands for too long. And now we're playing kind of catch up, aren't we, to some extent?
No, that's right. I mean, but it goes back to what I said before about that neurolinguistic programming. You're making people focus on the addicts, on the poor outcomes, on the suicides. You are not allowing people to contemplate the idea that 99.8% of people gamble risk-free. So you are making them focus on the negative.
Yes,
that's the problem.
And that's skillful. I think they've done that really, really well. And in the media, that kind of view has been hitherto unopposed on daytime TV. I mean, I think we spoke.
Well, that's what Animal Rising did, wasn't it? Two racehorses die every week. They repeated that again and again because they want you to focus on equine fatality. Forget about the fact that 99.8% of horses come back off the track safely. They want you to focus on the fatalities.
Yeah. On those outliers, and they extrapolate, don't they? But by sort of inviting people to conclude that the whole sport is rotten to the core and run by people that don't care about animal welfare.
Well, that's the thing is, if you don't give everyone, and this is part of the reason why it's all kind of wrapped up in mistruths. If you don't give people all the data, they then draw their own false conclusions. So again, you're not outright lying. You're just not giving them all the facts to come to the correct conclusion. So, for example, if I said to you, 2 racehorses die a week, if I said that to someone on the street, they'd think, oh, actually, blimey, that sounds like quite a lot. Because, of course, you haven't told them how many racehorses race a week. You can't contextualise that data. If only 10 are racing a week, well, yeah, that is an awful lot. But that's not the case at all. If you don't tell them that 99.8% of racehorses come back off the track safely, then they will conclude that 2 horses a week is a terrible number. If you don't tell them that I think it was for about 5 years we had no Grand National fatalities, but you told them this year that there were 3, they will come to the conclusion that the Grand National is not a safe sport. So it is very, very cleverly done. They know all the techniques to do this. They don't come out and say we want to ban gambling outright, because most reasonable people are against outright bans. Most people are not kind of the extremist end of the continuum. So what they do is they break it down into sizable chunks. And this is, again, why we cannot separate out gambling products, because they will come for all of them eventually. They want to ban gambling. They will get each and every one of them. So they know exactly what it is they have to do to get to their end goal. The regulations that they've come up with are ludicrously impractical. They're never going to work, but they're not supposed to work, because if they worked, then that would be the end of it. That would be the end of the story, closed book. But they want them to not work so they can do more.
Abby, to finish, are you disappointed, like I am, with the government on this?
Massively.
The thing is, I mean, a lot of criticisms are like labelled, if we're talking politics, are labelled at left wing, wanting cancellations, wanting, let's ban this. It's terrible for people, like you say, on false data. But the lack of pushback from DCMS and government, which is obviously why you fought to at least fight this. This is the disappointing aspect for me, that this government has failed to see the civil liberty argument, like straight away. Like you say, why do we want state control? Who wants state control? We don't want to live like Russia and China and North Korea.
Some people do, Lee. Some people love to be told what to do, and it's some people love a technocratic form of government. White coat syndrome. People who are cleverer than me can tell me what to do. They know what's best, and I think that's part of the problem. Part of society loves being told what to do because they don't have to think for themselves. And I think that's what you're kind of battling against. And the problem, I think, is that gambling has always enjoyed a slightly disreputable kind of. It's always been viewed as slightly disreputable. It's the old argument. Someone can quite happily drink 10 pints a night and not be regarded as an alcoholic. But that a different person can say, I have 10 bets a day. And a lot of people will conclude, well, you must be addicted to gambling. Never mind the fact that someone equally will spend the same amount of money on booze and, they can manage their drinking. There's a sense in some people that gamblers are, very far sort of down the totem pole of what's socially acceptable. And I told a story, I knew a guy that ruined his life through crack cocaine, and he told me that it would have been, it was easier for him to disclose to his family that he was addicted to crack cocaine than had he said he was addicted to gambling. His family supported him through his drug recovery, but he said he couldn't guarantee that they would enjoy the same support had he said he was a gambler. And that's a strange thing to me, but some people hold that view.
Indeed. Food for thought there. Great podcast. Support the Gamblers Consumer Forum. You can go to their website. Certainly we've retweeted a lot of their stuff. You can find them on Twitter. Abby and Andrew Woodman, great people. Support them, folks, because it's the one chance. And I know going forwards, Abby's got some future media engagements with various parties in the general public domain. So we're going to look forward to that. So please support them, because we are trying. This is an important thing that we need to sort of beat. We're up against massive funding in terms of the other side. It really is a very hard task to achieve. But we certainly don't want dystopia in terms of gambling. So this is important. No matter what you think, no matter what your political beliefs, no matter what your beliefs are on direction of how we should tackle this, it's Last Chance Saloon, guys. So please support the Gamblers Consumer Forum. I've enjoyed this sermon. We've had two kind of different battles. It's been interesting. Thank you, John. Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Chris. That's all from us. Bye for now.